Okay, thank you. Okay, I'll try to be fast because the coffee break. Okay, thank you, Ana Paula, for the invitation, and okay, I hope it will be a pleasure conference. So, okay, Tony already presented me. So the title of my communication is a little bit different from Pierre and Baldinato. I'm going to discuss specific content, but something about the classrooms and so on. And the title of my communication is Contextual Reading of Primary Sources, a proposal for university courses of history of science. Okay, so beginning. This is a work, this is an ongoing work, this is an ongoing project. This is, in fact, this is something of a life project. And this work is built on experience. In 2009, I became professor of history of science courses in a federal university in Brazil, the countryside of Brazil. And since then, almost 10 years ago now, since then I been teaching history of science, specifically history of physics. And since then, I wanted to discuss with my students primary sources, to take to classroom some primary sources that could be discussed. And the first one that I have ever introduced in a classroom situation was Newton's Optics. This was a book published in 1704 at the beginning of the 18th century. And as you see from your right, this is the Portuguese version of the book. It was translated by Professor André Assis from State University of Campinas. And the reason why I chose this book was because I was studying the book at that time. And I was studying the context of 18th century optics. I have just finished my master dissertation. And so that was the book that I knew the most at that time. And I wanted to know, I wanted to show to my students the words of Newton, how he thought about light, what he wrote about light, how he defined colors, for example, how he discussed his famous experiments with prisms, how he discussed the material nature of light, and so on. So that's my basic idea, objective at that time. Okay, and whoops, sorry. And okay. And I don't know if for my surprise or not, I think I was expecting that, but many of my students have never heard about Newtonian optics. They never knew that Newton had written a book on optics. They knew that, some of them knew that Newton had made some experiments with the prisms. They knew, of course, that Newton had written something on mechanics, Newton's laws, but they usually did not know where. If it was in a book, in a paper, in a manuscript, and under the tree, you know, they didn't know that. And that made me question at that time about why we do not study the classics, the classical books, the classical papers, the classical authors of our field. And I always made this, I don't know if this parallel is right, the philosophers can correct me, but in philosophy courses, it would be unimaginable that a philosophy student would not read at some point of his undergraduate course some of the classical authors. But that happens all the time with someone who studies physics, chemistry, biology, and mathematics. We do not study the classics. I did not study the classics in my undergraduate course until I enrolled in a history of science course, which was offered by Professor Roberto here, and so that happens all the time with the majority of our students. Of course, the situation has changed a little bit because we have now, at least in Brazilian universities or federal universities, some courses on history of science that is helping to change this situation. But in general, at that time, this was 2000 and when I was a university student, this was 2003 and 4. So that was the situation. And okay, so that moved me. At least I had to do something. I had to make my students know the classics, read something that our classical authors had written, and not just Halliday or Sears or all those university textbooks that we are, in physics at least, we are used to read. So in the past few years, I became professor in another university before UFABC and then UFABC. So I have been broadening my scope. I have been reading some other books in other areas, not only in physics, but something in biology too, in chemistry. And of course, I'm mentioning here just the physics and astronomy books. But I started to introduce other primary sources in my classes. So I worked with Galileo, I worked with Michael Faraday, I worked with Copernicus, I worked with Newton again, the Principia. And of course, all of these, I'm showing here the English versions, or the original, not the original in the case of Galileo, but the English versions. But these books have Portuguese versions, published some years ago. So I started to introduce these materials to discuss with my students. This was like something not very structured. I just I was just bringing the sources and giving to the students, and then they read, sometimes at their own home, sometimes in classroom, and then we would discuss what that author had said, what that mean, and so on. But that showed that I was trying to not to discuss just Newtonian optics, which was my field of research, but other authors. During these attempts, I noticed, of course, some difficulties. First of all, the language barrier. There are not many Portuguese versions of classical primary sources, although the situation has changed over the years. And that is important because not more than 5% of our population here in Brazil speaks another language. So we usually do not speak English, we do not read English, even other languages as French and Italian, for example. So we have to have Portuguese versions of these books. One other thing, the style of writing in these old books and papers are not very familiar to our students. We do not have chapters and sections and paragraphs and everything explained in just a quite clear way. Sometimes the books are very difficult to understand. For example, Newton's Principia, it's a very difficult book to understand. So the reading of these materials are not very easy. Words and concepts are also not very familiar to our students. For example, when I mention the word force, force does not mean exactly what we understand as force today when we read a 17th century book or well, I don't know if there's that word in a 16th century book, but the changes of meaning happen. Okay, for example, heat or energy. We do not have like a definite. How can I say? A definition, a right definition, or a constant definition all the time. And of course, the question of time. It takes time to discuss primary source. It takes time to introduce history of science in classroom situations. So it's not something that you can do in 1 hour or in 30 minutes. It takes time to prepare. It takes time to apply. It takes time to evaluate. So it's not. That's why sometimes this is not very attractive to everybody. Because it's really time-consuming. Of course, those difficulties are not entirely mine, and I'm quoting here just Brazilian authors that mention those difficulties on working with primary sources. Of course, they recognize the advantages. Problematization, the apprehension of scientific concepts, stimulation of curiosity, so on. But they also agree that those difficulties that I have pointed out, they exist, and that reflects directly on the number of proposals that works with primary sources in classroom situations. So again, this is difficult, and of course my aim here is not to bring a recipe, but is to discuss possibilities, solutions, and ideas. Okay, so what should we do about that? Should we give up and go back to our cookbook, our recipes, our traditional books, and what we have? And I think we should not. So, of course, one of the possible initiatives is to have adequate and professional translation of primary sources. Yesterday, we saw Professor Maria Alice work, and I think we should stimulate that. We have excellent Portuguese translations of some primary sources made by historians of science. I myself have dedicated some time to, doing this. I have translated one paper on light and colors by Thomas Young, and other paper on electricity by Benjamin Franklin. But these are specialized work. This is not something that you do from night to day. This is something that takes time, because you have, again, to understand the concepts, to understand the context, to understand the author, his or her backgrounds, and so on. So, but this is something that we should do. Okay, so relating to this, and going to the central point of this presentation, here comes the discussion of the of my proposal of contextual reading of primary sources. So how did this idea come up? So this began, as I said to you, I started to work with primary sources in classroom situations since I was a young and visionary professor in 2009, and but in 2016, I taught at the Federal University of ABC a course named Evolution of Physics, and this course was offered in English at the university. UFABC has it's not a tradition, but it's more like a goal to offer sometimes courses in English, trying to be more international, and that's why when you see the rankings of UFABC, it is one of the most international universities of Brazil. And then I taught this course, Evolution of Physics, and that was some of a paradise for me, because now I had the opportunity to bring to the classroom many original sources, or primary sources. As I studied most British and North American, Canadian authors, that was easy for me. The original sources were already in English, and I could bring to classroom and discuss with them. And one of the sources that I most used was William Maggie's A Source Book in Physics. For those who don't know this book, it contains several extracts from different authors, extract from important works of different authors. Newton, we're talking about physics, so Newton, Galileo, Gray, Diffie, and so on, Franklin, and so on. So I used a lot this book. So I was fortunate that my colleague, the colleague that shares the office with me, he has a physical copy of this book, so I could use it. Okay, so that made me think about a way to discuss more how can I say that, to use the most that I could get from these original sources, and that made me try to develop, it's not a method, but some kind of a structure, and that made me elaborate this idea of contextual reading. Okay, so I'm going to explain some of the basic features of this contextual reading. It was not used in 2016, but that opportunity made me, or led me to elaborate this idea. So one of the things that is involved in this contextual reading of primary sources is the definition of context. And I've been working with contextual teaching for, since 2009. And one definition that I like the most is the one by Stephen Klassen. This is from a paper that he wrote he published in 2006. And it's the title is a framework for contextual teaching, something like this. And he defines context as the entities that connect to or surround a focal entity and contribute to the meaningfulness of the whole. So this is a picture from his work. Of course, his work involves many other things, involves narrative and so on. This is something that I do not use, but I'm most interested in his definition of context. Okay, so for Klassen, you have a concept or ability, and then you approach, or you study, or you develop this concept or ability through different contexts. In his case, he has theoretical context, practical, affective, historical, social, and so on. So that's, for me, the idea of context. Like you have something in the middle, in the center, that you aim to study from different perspectives, and when you look in the whole, that study contributes to the meaningfulness of that entity, of that idea. Okay? The other things that that are the foundations of these contextual readings are, in the first place, the problematization of knowledge, and this I take the words from Paulo Freire, who is a Brazilian, one of the most famous Brazilian educators. And Freire understands that the knowledge must be treated in a way that stimulates the curiosity, in a way that instigates the students to learn more. And so the problematization is something that I take to this idea, and of course something that we all share in different levels, in different ways. The purpose to introduce and discuss nature of science in classroom. So all of this was gravitating around me at this time. And of course, all of this made me to elaborate this idea of contextual reading. And there is something else, maybe behind all this, maybe fundamenting all this, which is the idea of critical and transformative educations of teachers. I have been working since 2009 in teacher training courses. So the idea of transform teacher education to bring other meanings for teacher education was my constant goal. So to make teachers have a critical dialogue with the world, problematize and transform the world, have a wider and reflexive comprehension of science and its relation to social, cultural, and political context, to be responsible to foment critical attitudes of their students, to respect the autonomy of their students as unique and complex individuals, and of course, to promote this critical and transformative educations. I see the role of history and philosophy of science, and of course that, and well, I take this moment to say that me and Cibele have published a chapter in Cibele and Maria Alice's book on this matter, where we develop all these ideas and concepts and why history and philosophy of science have a role on this critical and transformative education of teachers. So basically, defining the contextual reading. So I define contextual reading of primary sources as the study of primary sources from their core ideas and concepts, their writing process, and the scientific and cultural backgrounds of their authors. You will see with the example that I will discuss, that this is a very simple idea. This is something that maybe, and I'm pretty sure that happened, other researchers, other educators have already done. But I think that we should write this. I think that we should put this in words. This is something simple. This is something that maybe we do in our everyday class, but we should write, because when we write that, when it is published, when it's written, that's why it can be discussed. That's why no. That's how it can be discussed. It can be criticized. It can be improved. Okay. It disappeared. Okay, so going further, how I understand the structure of the contextual reading. Okay, so first of all, you have a problematization. Okay, so something that engage the students, engage the participants, something that stimulate their curiosities, that attract their curiosity. Then you have the contextual reading, which is the analysis of the primary sources from the different contexts. And during this process, during this contextual reading, and at the end, you have the discussion of nature of science. now it can be you can see that as a little confusing, but I hope that you understand when I put the example. So, what is the contextual reading? Showing in a bigger picture. Okay, so basically, I understand the contextual reading, the study of context, etc. But one of the first things that we do when we are doing the contextual reading is to slice the primary source. Okay, so here I put a letter of Benjamin Franklin, and one of the first steps of the contextual reading is to divide the study of the primary source. Okay, so it's like you're cutting the primary sources into different parts, and for each part you study with different contexts, and during this process you discuss nature of science. Again, this can be a little confusing, but I hope that with the example you will get it. Okay? So the steps of the contextual reading. So first step is the problematization. As I told you, something that engages the students. Second step is what I call the full reading of the primary sources, when the students read all the primary source, when they read all the text. That is why the length is so important. So you have to consider this thing. That is why the time is so important too. Then, in the third moment, you raise doubts and questions from this first reading. Then you apply the contextual reading, that division that I told you, the study of from the different contexts. And then you have the synthesis. And in these two final steps, you are always discussing the nature of science. Okay, so going to the example. In the abstract, I mentioned the first example that I used, the pilot application, that involved some, basically not some, but one letter that Galileo Galilei wrote to Benedetto Castelli at the beginning of the 17th century. It's a very famous letter on the relation of science and faith. This letter, we have a book published in Brazil called Science and Faith, and it has some of the letters that Galileo wrote at this time on the matters of how science is relating with the religious knowledge. And this pilot application happened in a course called Birth and Development of Modern Science. It is a course open to every student of UFABC. So not only teachers, but future engineers, bachelors, and philosophers, economists, everybody do this course. And this pilot application was very, very interesting. But I will not discuss this pilot application. And I will discuss a second application that I did in the time that I sent the abstract to now. Okay? So that second application happened in the course Evolution of Physics, again, that time offered in Portuguese. Okay? And again, this is a course open to any student of UFABC. So it was, we have some, maybe 5 physics students, then chemistry, philosophy, engineers, and a whole bunch of people, different people. And this happened while I was discussing the history of electricity. So, okay, first of all, you have to understand that UFABC is a weird university, at least in Brazil, because we do not have semesters. We have trimesters. So we have 3 periods in the year, and we have 12 weeks. and not 15 or 18 weeks as usually in other Brazilian universities. So it's a very short time to discuss a lot of things. So I selected some episodes to discuss with my students. I have discussed something on mechanics and astronomy, and then optics, and then the third part was on electricity. So that was when I introduced this contextual reading approach using Benjamin Franklin, who was an author that I was studying at that time. So basically, I wanted to discuss his ideas on electricity and the famous experiment with the kite. Okay? I think that everybody knows it's a famous anecdote in physics. So what did the students know? What I have discussed before? I have discussed some previous ideas on previous Franklin. Previous ideas on electricity by Stephen Gray, for example, Charles Duffy, Nollet, and Franklin himself. For example, one thing that I did before applying the contextual reading was discuss the previous studies of Benjamin Franklin. And I discussed basically the content of his two first letters on electricity, where, for someone who doesn't know what Franklin did on electricity, he did not write a book on electricity. His book was a collection of letters and essays and so on that was published for the first time in 1751. And it had many, 5 editions with additions and corrections later. But that's what Franklin wrote on electricity. So these are the first 2 letters that Franklin wrote on this matter. These letters were sent to Peter Collinson, who was his friend and his correspondent in Britain. And in these letters, he discussed, for example, the power of points. What is the power of points? It's the power of pointed bodies, like a needle, for example, or a knife, to extract electricity from other bodies, from bodies that are already electrified, or to, using his own words, throw off the electricity, which means that if you attach a pointed body for example, in a globe, in a globe of sulfur, for example, this globe cannot be electrified because he has a pointed body attached to him. So the electricity, according to Franklin, would be thrown off. So I discussed that with the students. These were very traditional classes, me in the front discussing, showing the pictures and the text and so on. We have discussed positive and negative electrifications, early experiments with the Leyden jar, early ideas on the electrical nature of lightnings, and the explanation of how thunderstorms are formed. So the students already knew that. Okay, new, I don't know, but they already have seen this. Okay, I have already discussed these issues. Okay, so how did I start the contextual reading? Problematization, the first step. How did I make the problematization? So I show to the students a lot of pictures of the experiment with the kite. Okay? So if you type on Google Franklin kite, you will see many pictures, engravings, paintings, modern, old. You'll see a lot. I like the most this painting from the 19th century. This is a painting by Benjamin West, where you can see Franklin. He has the knot of his finger. You see a little spark here. You see the key. You see a lot of angels surrounding him. This is one of my favorite. And you have other representations. Okay, this is, I guess, this is from a college textbook, if I'm not mistaken, showing again Franklin and probably his son. Okay, with him, his son. Okay. I show these pictures. Of course, I show every time a different picture to the students, and I was asking questions like this. What does this picture show? Did Franklin really do the kite experiment? If he did, what led him to propose such an experiment? What would he have concluded with it? So this is the problematization. This is why I started the discussion. This is why I attempted to stimulate the curiosity of my students to let them analyze and discuss Franklin's work. So, as the primary source that I used an essay that Franklin wrote in 1749 called or entitled "Opinions and Conjectures." This is the short title. And this was an essay that he sent to Peter Collinson after those two letters and after other letters on the Leyden jar. And they received a Portuguese translation made by me. Yeah, this is a long essay. And the first obstacle that I had to face was that the essay was too long. So I divided the essay into 3 parts. So I gave one part to the students, made the discussion, made the contextual reading, and then I gave the other part, and so on. Okay? So I will discuss the second part that I gave to them. And that part, in that part, Franklin discussed his Sentry-Box experiment. I'm going to say the Portuguese word. This is what we call experimento da guarita. Okay? This is like it's a small house, as we can say, and that there's a person in here, and from an isolated object, it comes out an iron rod, okay, up to the sky, a very long iron rod. So this is the Sentry-Box experiment, and that's what Franklin discussed in this part of the book. Okay. So this I'm not going to read, of course. This is okay. That's okay. This is what of course the students read the Portuguese version. This is the original version. As you can see, Franklin mentioned figure 9. Figure 9 is this figure here. Okay, figure 9. That's where he's discussing this experiment. You will see what is the relation between this experiment with the kite. You will see. So the students read all this, and then I started to. I went to the next step, full reading. So they read all this text, and then we started to discuss some doubts, some questions, some ideas. So this was the third part, the doubts and question parts. Okay. So what is the purpose of this experiment? How does it work? And so on. And then we started the contextual reading. So the contextual reading is when you detail, using the context, some parts of the text. Remember, trying to make it meaningful as a whole. So, for example, coming back to the text, when Franklin says, to determine the question whether the clouds that contain lightning are electrified or not. So that part, and the students have already noticed this, and I try to emphasize during this contextual reading, during this discussion. When Franklin say, to determine the question whether the clouds that contain lightning and so on, this indicates that the discussions on the nature of light were common at that time. So this was something that was was on the table at that time. The nature of lighting. So Franklin was probably no. He was not the first person to think of the nature of lighting. Okay. For example, when he says, "I would propose an experiment to be tried where it may be done conveniently," when he says the word "I would," for this, of course, I'm not basing it on my assumptions, but from assumptions from other historians. This suggests that Franklin, at that time, had not performed the experiment that he was proposing at that time. So I would propose, so this was probably a hypothesis, not a hypothesis in a Newtonian sense, but an idea and a proposition. Okay? So this is the contextual reading. When he says, for example, and then he's mentioned. Okay, I'll read. From the middle of the stand, let an iron rod rise and pass, bending out the door, and then upright 20 or 30 feet, pointed very sharp at the end. When he says that, and students have already noticed this, he's relating to his previous ideas. The power of points, the power that pointed bodies have to extract or throw off electricity. So this is, I think this is the good thing about a contextual reading, because you point out some things that in a full reading, when you just read and okay, what did you understand or not? It might not appear. So when you analyze these little things, these small details from different perspectives, you can highlight some things that can be interesting, some things related to the nature of scientific knowledge. The other extract, for example, when he says, "If any danger to the man should be apprehended, though I think there would be none, let him stand, da 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 da." So when he says that, Franklin, that means that Franklin, and as well as other natural philosophers at that time, had not the idea that these experiments, or the experiments with electricity, especially with the lightnings, with the clouds electrified, could be dangerous. Remember, Franklin is proposing an experiment. He probably did not make the experiment. For example, when he says, "So the sparks, if the rod is electrified, will strike from the rod to the wire and not affect him." This is when he mentioned this, the sparks and the effects that would be produced. This has a relation with the fact that Franklin was not trying to extract electricity from the lightnings. He did not want a lightning to strike the rod, because, if he wanted that, he would probably be a crazy person. But his aim with all this discussion, with all these experiments, was to verify if clouds that contain lightnings were electrified. So his aim was to study the clouds, not the lightning themselves. So he assumed that the cloud was like an electrified body, and then with a pointed body he could extract electricity and notice some small sparks. Okay? Continuing with the contextual reading, we mentioned, for example, the reproduction of Franklin experiment, Sentry-Box experiment in France, after the publication of his book, and this was very successful. Franklin's book was rapidly translated to French, by the influence of Buffon, to mention. And Franklin became, at that time, some not very famous, but something famous. So it was reproduced, and here you can see the whole picture. You can see the Sentry-Box, the iron rod, okay, and then extracting electricity from the clouds. Of course, many people tried to do this at that time, and Georg Richman died in 1753. Okay, I'm finishing. And probably because he was struck in a lightning, probably because he was not standing over an isolated material. So, okay. Step 5, synthesis. So after all this discussion, after all this contextual approach, I made a synthesis of this. So Franklin probably had not performed the Sentry-Box experiments. He always made reference to his previous ideas and concepts. He did not know that the experiment could be dangerous, as his followers, until Richman's death. And he wanted to study electrification in clouds, not exactly the lightnings. They were an indication that clouds could be electrified. And this is what I think that shows the nature of scientific knowledge. How a scientist, he does not know at first everything. He's trying, he's speculating, he's proposing. He does not know how dangerous could be an experiment. He always is making reference to his previous ideas. So this is something that is related with the development of knowledge, of scientific knowledge. Finishing. So the part of the kite, just to end the discussion, we made another contextual reading on the kite. I gave to the students the letter that Franklin wrote, where he described the kite experiment. This was a letter to Peter Collinson. It was published in Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society in 1752. And again, the students received a Portuguese translation. This is a small letter. You wouldn't imagine that the kite experiment, the great experiment of Franklin, was just described in a small letter. It is not very... how can I say, not very instigated letter. So the students read, this is the original one, okay, December 21, and so on. And then again, we raise some doubts and questions on this, and then we proceed the contextual reading. Of course, the contextual reading is much longer than this. I'm just pointing out some ideas. For example, one of the things that we pointed out in this contextual reading is the date. The French reproduction of the experiment was made probably by June, I guess, 1752. 52. So Franklin knew that the experiments were made, the experiments were successful, and he mentions this, as frequent mention is made in the public papers from Europe of the success of the Philadelphia experiment for drawing the electricity and so on. So that's something that in a full reading you may not realize. You have to combine, to study from a bigger picture. When he says, for example, the same experiment has succeeded in Philadelphia, though made in a different and more easy manner. So when Franklin is saying this, he's saying that the kite experiment was a version of the Sentry-Box experiment. In fact, the kite has had also a pointed body in it, attached to it. So it's not just a kite, a normal kite. It has it was a long kite, big kite with a sharpened body attached to it. Though made in a different and more easier manner. When he says though made, probably the experiment was performed, but Franklin did not offer any other details. I'm finishing. Just one slide. I said that I would take, you were going to wait me to eat the coffee break. So those details are in a description by Joseph Priestley in a book that he published on the history of electricity many years later. Easy manner. So Franklin thought the kite experiment was easier than the Sentry-Box. Okay, synthesis. So the kite experiment, when we do all the contextual reading, was not so important to Franklin. Later in his autobiography, he mentioned it just as a similar case of the capital, the crucial experiment of the Sentry-Box. So he praised much more the Sentry-Box experiment with the guy inside than with the kite. Franklin himself did not mention how he performed the experiment in the letter. The letter is just a description of how you make the kite, and not how to perform. No, that's something how to perform, but he did not mention that he performed that way. And probably the most of the modern reports are based on, as I said, Joseph Priestley's descriptions in his book on the history of electricity, which was published something of 15 years 15 years after. So this again shows the nature of science. This again shows that something that we understand as, that's the experiment, Franklin did the experiment. No, that's not that way. Things are a little bit more fascinating. So, finish. So again, this is an ongoing project. I'm happy to hear ideas, comments, critiques. And for now, the ideas have shown, at least by me, interesting results. And of course, much needs to be done. Thank you very much.
So, we have a few minutes, so I think we can one turn of questions and Breno answers. Okay? Who have questions? Andrea? Okay. Okay. We try have a short questions because we have 5 people. Okay. All the questions one time. Okay, all questions one time, and Breno answers.
Breno, thank you very much for your presentation. I agree with you that the idea has so interesting results. And I'm thinking here about that. I know that you have, the Frank have Imagine, yes, scientific Imagine. But do you discuss this with the students? Why I'm talking about this? We are discussing some authors in Rio de Janeiro, in our group, that discuss that the way to produce scientific images are changed throughout history. And this manner said so much about the history of science. Yes? And so this is a very important primary source. Maybe you could improve. I'm not sure if in this case, because it's a very direct image, but the people who are involved in this production and the way sometimes they put details, sometimes not details, and this is different from different period of history.
You mean the images of the kite experiment, right?
Yes, yes. In this case, you have only one image. Yes.
No, I have.
No. In this paper from the Frank have only one image.
No, Franklin paper. Okay,
no.
The kite. We don't have images of the kite.
Yes, the kite. See, but the first one that you have.
The Sentry-Box.
Yes,
yeah, just that picture.
Yes. So
that
something for
man.
other works, but I think it's something very important. Not very important, but something to consider. Okay. But thank you very much for the presentation.
Thank you, Breno. I agree with you, but I want to take a little bit of an issue. You started off by talking about translations take time, original sources take time. Being an English speaker, when I read the Franklin and I read Newton, it takes time. So my concern is with the translation. are you preserving the style in the translation? Because then that'll still take time. So I'm not sure you've solved that element in the process. And to give you an example, and here's where I would take a little bit of an issue. Your the contextual reading of one of Franklin's, where he says, you know, with respect to the sentry inside that box, if one should apprehend, he says, right? Your interpretation of that was that he had not considered the dangers. But when I read that, I'm saying, no, he's actually considering the dangers of what might happen with a lightning strike. And so I thought he was being ethical. If you're worried about being, you know, burnt and disintegrated from this experiment, to put it mildly, stand on this object, right? But we don't normally talk as if saying, or we don't say if one has any apprehensions. We normally say if you're really scared about electricity hitting you, you might want to do this, right? So I'm concerned that something might get lost in the translation that's actually important.
Can I answer that? Okay.
Well, I hope you can.
Okay, very quick. Of course, this presentation had 50 slides, and I was going to discuss the process of translation of these sources, because that took some time. I did that since 2016. So when I applied this course, I had translated, retranslated. It was really and the Opinions and Conjectures is a very long essay. So yes, in the Portuguese version, I'm not sure if I succeeded or not, but I maintained this idea that Franklin showed in the original version. Okay? But yes, I agree that he saw some danger, and that's why he okay, that's not being quick, but okay. Ana Paula, you did not ask. So he stood on the wax, right? And but I still think that he did not believe that it could be so dangerous as it really was. I believe in that. Okay, but we can talk later.
Yeah, I suggest that the other questions you can do outside, and then we can return. Okay. Okay. Thank you very much, Breno.
Thank you.